Lyra Moonshadow walked through the burning forest with her dragon close behind, and the smell of smoke filled her lungs as she searched for survivors from the last battle, and her people were losing this war badly, and everyone knew it. But nobody wanted to say it out loud, and the Obsidian Empire was pushing closer every day with their dark magic and corrupted armies. Ember growled low in her throat, and the massive crimson dragon stopped suddenly, and her silver-tipped wings folded tight against her scaled body, and Lyra raised her hand in a silent command, and something was wrong. Because Ember never acted this way around strangers, and the dragon was supposed to attack intruders on sight, but instead she was moving forward slowly like she recognized something in the trees ahead. A man lay collapsed against a burned oak tree, and his clothes were strange and worn, and covered in symbols that Lyra had never seen before in all her centuries of life. And he was human, which was odd, because humans rarely came this far into elven territory, and most of them feared the dragons too much to travel alone, and this one looked half dead from exhaustion and old wounds that had healed badly across his arms and chest. Lyra approached carefully with her hand on her sword, and she called out to him in the common tongue, but he did not respond, and she tried again in 3 other languages, but still nothing. And Ember pushed past her and lowered her great head to sniff at the stranger, and the dragon made a sound that Lyra had never heard before, and it was almost like recognition or maybe respect. The man opened his eyes, and they were gray like storm clouds and filled with a sadness so deep that Lyra actually stepped back, and he looked at Ember and then at Lyra. But he did not speak, and he did not reach for a weapon, and he simply watched them with those terrible sad eyes and waited. Lyra made a decision that her council would hate, and she offered him water from her flask, and he took it with shaking hands and drank slowly, and she asked him his name and where he came from and why he was here, but he only shook his head and pointed to his throat and made no sound at all. The war was going poorly, and Lyra needed every advantage she could find, and something about this silent stranger made Ember trust him, and dragons were never wrong about people, and so Lyra decided to bring him back to Silvermere, and her second-in-command would be furious, but that was nothing new. They returned to the city as the sun set and the walls were damaged from the last attack, and her people looked tired and afraid, and Beth Sterling met them at the gate with anger already showing on her face, and she demanded to know why Lyra had brought a human into their stronghold during wartime, and Lyra had no good answer, except that Ember trusted him. The council meeting was exactly as bad as Lyra expected, and the elders argued that the stranger could be a spy, and that humans could not be trusted, and that the Obsidian Empire often used tricks and deception, and Commander Beth agreed with them loudly and demanded that the human be thrown in the dungeons or sent away immediately. But old Margaret Hayes stood up slowly, and she was the oldest scholar in Silvermere, and she had studied the ancient texts for longer than most elves had been alive, and she walked close to the silent man and looked at the symbols on his skin, and her eyes went wide with something like fear, or maybe wonder. Margaret said that these marks were older than the elven kingdoms and older than most races in the galaxy, and they belonged to something called the Terran Wardens from human legends, and they were supposed to be protectors who defended worlds in the time before time, and everyone thought they were just stories. But here was a man with their symbols carved into his flesh. Lyra asked the stranger if this was true, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then nodded once and slowly, and the room went silent because legends were not supposed to walk into your city and collapse in your forest. Beth still did not trust him, and she said that anyone could carve symbols into their skin, and that meant nothing, and the stranger needed to prove himself or leave, and Lyra felt torn, because Beth was right to be cautious, but something in her heart said this man was important. The stranger was given a small room in the dragon stables, because that was the only place Ember would let him go, and the dragon refused to leave his side, and she curled up outside his door like she was guarding something precious, and Lyra had never seen her bonded dragon act this way in all their years together. Days passed, and the war grew worse, and 3 more border villages fell to the Empire, and Lyra lost 2 dragon riders in an ambush, and their dragons were corrupted by void magic and turned into mindless beasts, and everyone was talking about surrender. The silent stranger spent his time drawing in the sand of the training yard, and at first people ignored him, but then Beth noticed that his drawings were maps, and they showed enemy positions that he could not possibly know. And when scouts checked his information, it was always correct, and that made Beth even more suspicious. Lyra began visiting the stranger in the evenings, and she would sit with him and talk about the war and her fears and her duty, and he never spoke, but he listened. And sometimes he would write simple words in the sand to answer her, and his handwriting was strange and old-fashioned and beautiful. She learned that he wanted to be called Cain, and that he had been traveling alone for a very long time, and that he could not or would not speak for reasons he would not explain. And she learned that he knew battle tactics better than her best commanders, and that he understood dragons in ways that even dragon riders did not. An assassination attempt came on the night of the new moon, and a blade was meant for Lyra. But Cain moved faster than any elf she had ever seen, and he caught the blade with his bare hand and threw the assassin across the courtyard, and blood ran down his arm. But he did not make a sound, and his eyes never left Lyra to make sure she was safe. The old traditions said that a life debt must be repaid, and that the person who saved a royal commander could ask for anything within reason. And Cain wrote in the sand that he wanted nothing, and Lyra said that was not acceptable and the debt must be honored. She offered him a bond marriage, which was an ancient ceremony that would make him a citizen and give him protection and a place in elven society. And it was mostly symbolic, but it meant something. And Cain stared at her for a long time, and she saw something in his eyes that looked like regret and pain and determination all mixed together. He wrote one word in the sand, and it said yes, and they were married 3 days later in a small ceremony with only Ember and Beth and Margaret as witnesses, and Cain wore simple clothes and said nothing during the vows, and Lyra wondered what she had just done. Beth pulled her aside after and said that Lyra had made a terrible mistake, and that they knew nothing about this man, and that legends or not, he could still be dangerous, and Lyra agreed, but said that sometimes you had to take risks, and that Ember trusted him, and that had to mean something. The Obsidian Empire sent a message the next day, and they demanded surrender, and they wanted Lyra to disband her dragon corps and submit to their rule, and they promised mercy if she complied within 1 week, and they promised destruction if she refused. Cain was standing in the council chamber when the message was read, and he listened carefully, and then he picked up a piece of chalk and walked to the strategy board and began drawing. And what he drew was insane, and showed a strike directly at the heart of the Empire through terrain that was supposed to be impossible to cross. Beth laughed and said it was suicide, and the council agreed, and Lyra looked at her silent husband and asked if he really thought it could work. And Cain met her eyes and nodded once, and wrote beneath the map that sometimes the impossible was the only option left. That night, Lyra lay awake in her chambers, and Cain sat by the window watching the stars, and she asked him why he had agreed to marry her, and he wrote that she had shown him kindness when she did not have to, and that kindness was rare in the galaxy and worth protecting. She asked him if he had ever been married before, and he nodded and wrote that it was a long time ago, and that she was gone now, and Lyra did not ask more, because the pain in his eyes was answer enough. The week passed quickly, and the Empire was preparing for their final assault, and Lyra knew that her city could not withstand another attack, and the walls were weak, and her people were exhausted, and the dragons were too few. On the last day, Cain finished forging something in the smithy, and he had been working on it in secret using metals that Margaret had found in the old archives, and when Lyra saw it, she did not understand, because it was a sword, but like no sword she had ever seen. It hummed with energy and seemed to bend light around its edge, and Cain held it carefully, like it was both precious and terrible. And he wrote that he had hoped never to hold such a weapon again, but that hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. The attack came at dawn, and the sky filled with void creatures and corrupted dragons and soldiers in black armor, and the walls of Silvermere crumbled under the assault, and Lyra gave the order to evacuate the civilians and prepared to make her last stand. Cain walked past her toward the breach in the wall, and Ember followed him without being called, and Lyra shouted for him to stop, but he did not listen, and he reached the broken gate and turned back to look at her one last time. He knelt down on one knee, and for the first time since she found him, he spoke, and his voice was deep and resonated with power that shook the stones, and he said one word, and the word was no. Then he stood and drew his sword and walked alone into an army of thousands, and Lyra realized that her silent husband was something far more dangerous than any legend. Cain stood before the army, and his sword glowed with a light that hurt to look at directly, and the enemy forces stopped advancing because something in their ancient instincts recognized danger, and the void creatures that feared nothing suddenly hesitated. Lyra watched from the walls as her husband moved, and it was not like elven combat or any fighting style she knew, and he was faster than thought, and his blade cut through void creatures like they were made of shadow. And everywhere he stepped, the corrupted magic burned away and left only clean air behind. The enemy tried to surround him, but Ember dove from the sky, and her fire was hotter than it had ever been before, and together the human and the dragon fought with a coordination that spoke of old partnership and deep understanding, and the Obsidian Empire forces began to retreat in disorder and confusion. By midday, the attack was broken, and the enemy was fleeing, and Cain stood among the bodies of 100 void creatures, and his sword still hummed with power. And he was not even breathing hard, and Lyra realized that he had been holding back, and this was only a fraction of what he could do. The city celebrated, but Lyra felt cold inside because her gentle, silent husband had just destroyed an army alone, and she did not know what that meant, and Beth came to her later and said that they needed to talk about Cain. Immediately, Margaret brought old books to the council chamber, and she spread them across the table and pointed to stories of the Terran wardens, and they were not just protectors, but warriors who had defended hundreds of worlds, and their technology was beyond anything the current galaxy possessed. Beth asked why Cain had stopped fighting and why he had taken a vow of silence, and Margaret said the texts spoke of a great war among humans, and that they had nearly destroyed themselves, and that the survivors went into hiding and swore never to fight again. Lyra went to Cain that evening and found him in the dragon stables cleaning his sword, and she asked him if the stories were true, and he looked at her and nodded, and wrote that he had hoped to die quietly without ever drawing a blade again. She asked how long he had been alone, and he wrote that it had been 3,000 years since his world fell, and since he had spoken to another human, and Lyra felt her heart break, because 3,000 years was longer than most civilizations lasted. Cain wrote that he had failed his people, and that he had made choices that led to their destruction, and that every world he had tried to protect afterward had fallen too, and that was why he stopped fighting, and why he took the vow of silence. But Lyra had offered him kindness, and Ember had chosen him, and he could not let them die when he had the power to prevent it, even if it meant breaking his vow and becoming the weapon he hated again. Word spread fast across the galaxy that a Terran warden had revealed himself, and old races that had hidden for millennia began sending messages, and some were hopeful and some were terrified, because humans were remembered as both saviors and destroyers. The Obsidian Empire sent a new message, and it was addressed directly to Cain, and it called him by a different name and said that Lord Malachar remembered him, and that they had fought together once, and that Cain had betrayed everything they built. Lyra asked Cain who Malachar was, and Cain closed his eyes and wrote that Malachar had been his captain and his friend and his brother, and that they had commanded fleets together before the fall. The message continued, and Malachar gave Cain a choice. And for every day that Cain stood against the empire, they would destroy one elven world, and they would start with the colonies and work their way to Silvermere, and Cain had 3 days to surrender himself. Beth argued that they should let Cain go and save their people, and that one man was not worth entire worlds, no matter how powerful he was, and half the council agreed with her. But Lyra said no, and she said that giving in to threats only invited more threats, and that they would find another way. And Cain looked at her with something like gratitude, and wrote that she was braver than he deserved. The first colony fell on schedule, and the Empire burned it completely and left no survivors, and the news reached Silvermere by the next morning, and the council was furious, and demanded that Lyra reconsider. Cain wrote that he would leave quietly, and that Lyra should not throw away her people for him, but Lyra refused, and said that he was one of her people now, and that they did not abandon their own. The second colony was evacuated in time, but the Empire destroyed it anyway, and turned the land into poisoned wasteland that would take centuries to heal, and the refugees came to Silvermere with stories of horror and void magic. Beth confronted Cain in private and drew her sword and said that he was a coward for hiding behind Lyra, and that real warriors did not let others suffer for their mistakes, and Cain simply looked at her and wrote one word, which was, "Wait." Lyra began having dreams that she did not understand, and in them she saw Cain leading armies across burning worlds and speaking languages that hurt to hear, and the stars themselves seemed to bend away from him in fear. She saw a younger Cain with joy in his eyes, and she saw him laugh and fight alongside other humans in silver armor, and she saw fleets of ships that could cross galaxies in heartbeats and technology that looked like magic. Then she saw the war and humans fighting humans and worlds cracking apart under weapons that should not exist, and Cain screaming orders as everything fell, and the dream always ended with him kneeling alone among ashes and taking his vow of silence. Ember began acting strangely and spending more time with Cain, and one night Lyra followed them and found Cain in the dragon stable speaking quietly to Ember in a language that sounded like music and fire, and the dragon was responding like she understood every word. Margaret discovered old records that said dragons were not native to this galaxy, and that they had been brought here by an ancient race, and the timing matched with human civilization. And Lyra realized that maybe dragons and humans had always been partners. The third day came, and the Empire prepared to destroy another colony, and Lyra gathered her forces to try to defend it. But Cain stopped her and wrote that he had a different plan. He had been in contact with other hidden humans across the galaxy, and they were coming out of exile, and 5 other Terran wardens were traveling to Silvermere, and together they would strike at the Empire directly. Beth said it was still suicide, and 6 humans could not defeat an empire. But Cain wrote that they were not going to fight the Empire, and they were going to rescue someone first. Lyra asked who, and Cain wrote her name, and she did not understand until Beth burst in with news that Lyra had been ordered to attend a diplomatic meeting on neutral ground, and it was obviously a trap. Cain had known it was coming, and that was why he had waited. And he wrote that Malachar wanted Lyra as bait to draw Cain out into the open, and that the Empire would take her and use her against him. The council forbade Lyra from going, but she said that if she did not go, then the Empire would know they suspected the trap and would change their plans, and at least this way they had warning. Cain wrote that she should not go and that he would find another way, but Lyra said that sometimes you had to take risks, and she smiled at him because those were his words from before. She went to the meeting with a small guard, and it went exactly as Cain predicted, and Empire soldiers surrounded them and used void magic to block dragon bonds, and Lyra was taken prisoner before she could even draw her sword. Beth was furious and said that Lyra had been foolish to walk into an obvious trap, and that now they had lost their commander, and Cain had better have a real plan. Cain gathered the 5 other Terran wardens who had arrived, and they were quiet, serious people, with old eyes, and they carried weapons like his, and they greeted him with respect and sorrow like they were meeting at a funeral. A woman named Claire Brooks was among them, and she was younger than the others, and she had maintained human technology in hiding for centuries, and she brought equipment that looked like it belonged in museums. Kane laid out his plan, and it was indeed insane, and they would infiltrate the Obsidian Empire fortress, which was hidden in a collapsed star, and rescue Lyra and discover what Malachar was really planning. Beth demanded to come with them, and Kane wrote that it was too dangerous. But Beth said that Lyra was her commander and her friend, and that elves understood loyalty too. They left at dawn and traveled in a ship that Claire had kept hidden, and it moved through space in ways that seemed to ignore normal physics, and they reached the collapsed star in hours instead of weeks. The fortress was massive and protected by void magic and corrupted dragons and technology that predated current civilization. And Kane wrote that this place had been a human military station once, and that Malachar had taken it after the fall. They infiltrated using stealth systems that bent light and sound, and they moved through corridors that Kane remembered from another lifetime, and he led them deeper into the fortress heart. They found Lyra in a chamber filled with strange machines, and she was suspended in energy field. And Malachar stood before her doing something with dragon magic, and Lyra was screaming. Kane did not hesitate, and he drew his sword and leaped, and Malachar turned and smiled and said that Kane was finally too late because the extraction was complete. Malachar was human too, but corrupted by void magic, and he looked young. But his eyes were older than Kane, and he said that they were brothers once and that Kane had abandoned him. Kane spoke for the second time, and his voice was full of pain, and he said that Malachar had chosen power over protection, and that was not abandonment, that was consequence. They fought, and it was terrible and beautiful, and the other wardens freed Lyra and held off Empire forces, and Claire worked frantically at the machines trying to understand what Malachar had done. Lyra was weak but conscious, and she saw Kane fighting his former friend, and she saw the grief in every movement, and she understood that Kane had loved Malachar once like family. Malachar laughed and said that Kane was still too sentimental, and that was why humans fell. And he triggered something in the machines, and alarms began screaming. Claire shouted that Malachar had activated a doomsday weapon called the Cascade Protocol, and it would erase all advanced technology in the galaxy and reset civilization to primitive levels. Kane demanded to know why, and Malachar said that the galaxy was better without technology, and that the cycle of war would only continue otherwise, and this was mercy. The station began shaking, and Malachar escaped through a portal, and Kane had to choose between chasing him and saving his team, and he chose his team. They fled the station as it began to collapse, and the Cascade Protocol was spreading, and Claire said she could not stop it remotely, and they needed to reach the source code on Earth. Lyra asked where Earth was, and Kane went very still, and wrote that Earth was the human homeworld, and it had been hidden behind a quantum barrier for 3,000 years, and he had sworn never to return. Beth said they had no choice, and the galaxy was ending, and Kane needed to go home even if it hurt, and Kane looked at Lyra, and she nodded. As they escaped the collapsing station, Malachar sent one final message, and his voice was full of satisfaction, and he said that Kane had doomed them all just like before, and that some people never learned. The Cascade Protocol spread across the galaxy like a wave of change, and everywhere it touched, technology began merging with natural magic in unpredictable ways, and some worlds flourished, while others descended into chaos as their systems failed. Kane sat in the ship command center staring at star maps, and his hands were shaking, and Lyra came to sit beside him and asked if he was afraid to go home, and he wrote that he was terrified. She asked what had happened to Earth, and Kane wrote slowly that humans had fought their civil war above their homeworld, and weapons meant to destroy fleets had struck the planet instead, and nothing survived. The other wardens gathered, and they shared stories of Earth and what it had been like before the fall, and Claire talked about oceans and forests and cities that touched the sky, and they all carried the same grief in their eyes. Beth listened and said that she did not understand how a race so advanced could destroy themselves, and Kane wrote that intelligence and wisdom were not the same thing, and humans had one, but not enough of the other. The journey to Earth took weeks, because Claire had to calculate a path through the quantum barrier that had hidden it, and along the way, they saw the effects of the Cascade Protocol spreading. They passed a trading station where the computers had merged with the minds of the operators, and everyone was connected in a hive consciousness, and they seemed happy but also lost. They found a mining colony where the machines had become sentient and were debating philosophy with the miners instead of working, and nobody knew if this was good or bad. Lyra felt strange too, and her bond with Ember was changing, and she could feel the dragon more clearly than ever before, and sometimes she knew what Ember was thinking before the dragon knew herself. Kane checked on her constantly and wrote questions about her symptoms, and she realized he was worried that the cascade was affecting her, specifically because of what Malachar had done. Claire examined Lyra and found that the extraction process had created a link between Lyra and human technology, and that she was becoming a bridge between magic and machine, and this was not accidental. Malachar had planned this, and he knew Kane would come for Lyra, and he wanted Kane to bond with someone who was connected to the protocol, and Claire could not explain why, but she knew it was important. They reached the quantum barrier around Earth, and it was beautiful and terrible, and it looked like a wall of frozen light that stretched across space. And Claire began working on opening a path through Beth, kept watch on the sensors, and reported that they were being followed, and Empire ships were tracking them, and Malachar wanted them to reach Earth because it was part of his plan. Kane wrote that they had no choice, and they needed to reach Earth to stop the protocol, even if it was a trap, and the other wardens agreed and prepared for battle. The barrier opened like a door in space, and they flew through, and what they saw made everyone go silent, because Earth was not dead after all. The planet was covered in a silver network of technology that pulsed with life, and the oceans were still there, and the forests had regrown, and something had healed the world. In the 3,000 years it had been hidden. Kane was crying, and he did not try to hide it. And the other wardens were crying too. And Claire whispered that Earth had survived and rebuilt itself using human technology that had become alive. But there were Empire ships waiting on the other side of the barrier, and Malachar had been here already and prepared, and a massive fleet emerged from behind Earth-Moon and began attacking. The battle began, and Kane and the other wardens launched in small fighters that moved like they were thinking, and Ember flew beside them with Lyra on her back, and Beth manned the weapons on the main ship. It was chaos in space above Earth, and dragons fought corrupted beasts, and human technology clashed with void magic, and the planet below watched silently. Kane flew toward the largest Empire ship, and he knew that Malachar was there, and they needed to end this, and he pushed his fighter faster than it should go, and the machine responded to his need. Malachar's voice came over the communication channel and said that Kane had finally come home and that this was where it would all end and where humanity would be judged. Kane spoke back, and his voice was steady, and he said that Malachar had become the very thing they swore to fight against, and that using fear and control was not protection. Malachar laughed and said that Kane still did not understand, and that the protocol was mercy, and it would force the galaxy to start over without the weapons that destroyed worlds. Kane said that taking away choice was not mercy, and that people needed to learn and grow and make mistakes, and that was what made civilization meaningful. They met in personal combat on the hull of the Empire flagship, and their swords clashed with energy that lit up space, and both were Terran wardens, and both knew every technique ever developed. Lyra watched from Ember back, and she felt helpless, because this was beyond her, and then she felt something new, and it was the bond, changing and growing stronger. She reached out through the bond to Ember, and then further to Kane, and suddenly she was connected to all three of them, and it was overwhelming and beautiful, and she understood things she never had before. Kane felt it too, and his fighting changed and became faster and more certain, and Lyra was feeding him strength, and Ember was giving him instinct, and together they were something new. Malachar saw it, and stopped fighting, and his eyes went wide, and he said that this was impossible, and that humans could not bond like dragons did. And Kane said that apparently they could now. The protocol wave reached Earth system at that moment, and it washed over everyone and everything, and the merge accelerated, and human technology and dragon magic fused completely. Lyra gasped as power flooded through the bond, and she saw through Kane eyes and through Ember mind, and she felt the technology around her wake up and recognize her. The Empire ships began to falter, as their corrupted technology rejected the void magic and chose the natural merge instead, and soldiers stopped fighting as their weapons became useless. Malachar screamed in frustration and said that this was not how it was supposed to go, and that the protocol was meant to destroy, not create. And Kane said that life found a way. Claire's voice came over communication, and she said that the protocol source code was on Earth surface, and they needed to reach it to stabilize the merge, or everything would collapse into chaos. Kane looked at Malachar and offered his hand and said that they could fix this together, and that brothers should not die as enemies, and Malachar hesitated. For a moment it seemed like Malachar would take the hand, and then he smiled sadly and said that some things were broken beyond repair, and he triggered the flagship's self-destruct. Kane grabbed Lyra through the bond and pulled her and Ember away, and the other wardens scattered, and the flagship exploded in a burst of light that consumed a dozen Empire ships. They did not find Malachar's body in the debris, and Claire said that he probably transported away and that he would have a backup plan because he always did. The remaining Empire forces retreated and the battle was over, but the war was not, and they needed to reach Earth's surface immediately. They landed near what had been a major city, and the ruins were covered in silver technology that had grown like vines and trees, and the planet felt alive in a way that was both familiar and alien. Kane led them to the core facility, and it was deep underground and protected by systems that remembered him and opened without resistance, and they descended into Earth Heart. The source code chamber was vast and filled with machines that hummed with the original human technology, and in the center was a sphere of light that pulsed in rhythm with Lyra's heartbeat. Claire said that this was the control matrix for all human technology ever created, and that it had been waiting for 3,000 years for someone to return and guide it. Lyra approached the sphere and felt drawn to it, and the bond with Kane and Ember pulled her forward, and she reached out and touched the light. Everything stopped, and then she was everywhere and everywhen, and she could see the entire network of human technology across the galaxy and feel every place the protocol had touched. She saw Malachar plan clearly now, and he had meant to use the protocol to force the galaxy back to primitive state and then guide them carefully to rebuild without weapons. But the bond between Lyra and Kane and Ember had changed the protocol nature, and instead of destroying it was transforming and creating something that had never existed before. Lyra understood that she had a choice, and she could reverse the protocol and separate technology from magic and return everything to how it was before. Or she could complete the merge and create permanent change that would unite the body galaxy in ways never imagined, but with risks that nobody could predict. Kane appeared beside her in the vision space, and he was not physical, but he was there through their bond, and he said that this was her choice, not his. She asked what he thought, and he said that his people had failed because they tried to control everything, and maybe the answer was to trust. Instead, Lyra made her decision, and she chose to complete the merge but with safeguards, and she programmed the technology to require harmony and balance and to reject use by those who sought only power. The sphere exploded outward with light, and the protocol wave reversed and began flowing back to Earth, carrying the new programming with it. On the surface, Malachar appeared from a portal, and he looked tired and old, and he said that Kane had won, and that maybe he had been right. All along. He walked toward them slowly with his sword lowered, and said that he was sorry and that he had been trying to prevent another war and had started one. Instead, Cain stepped forward and embraced his old friend and said that forgiveness was possible and that they could rebuild together, and Malachar shook his head. Malachar said that some people carried too much guilt to be saved, and he looked at the sky and smiled and said that at least Earth would live. Then he dissolved into light and joined the protocol wave, and his final gift was his knowledge and his power, given freely to stabilize the merge. The wave completed its journey, and the galaxy transformed, and technology that had been cold and separate became warm and alive and responsive to need rather than command. Dragons everywhere felt the change, and their magic merged with human technology, and they became stronger and wiser, and able to communicate clearly with all races. Earth systems fully awakened, and the planet began healing the last scars of the ancient war, and forests grew faster, and oceans cleaned themselves, and the silver network pulsed with joy. Lyra opened her eyes back in her own body, and Cain was holding her hand, and Ember was pressed against them both, and the bond between them was permanent and unbreakable. Claire was crying happy tears and saying that they had done it and that humanity technology lived on, but better than before because it was balanced with nature. Beth landed the ship nearby and ran to check on Lyra and said that the Empire was surrendering, and that word was spreading across the galaxy about what happened. The other wardens gathered, and they looked at Earth with wonder and said that they could finally stop hiding and stop running and maybe even stop mourning. Cain spoke clearly for the third time and said that they should go home, and Lyra asked where home was, and he smiled and said anywhere she was. The galaxy was changing faster than anyone could track, and the merge between technology and magic created wonders and problems in equal measure, and representatives from hundreds of worlds came to Earth seeking guidance. Lyra found herself acting as ambassador between species because her bond with Cain and Ember made her uniquely qualified to understand both sides, and she spent long days in meetings trying to explain things she barely understood herself. Cain worked with the other wardens to help worlds adapt to their new merged systems, and he taught them that technology was a tool, not a master, and that wisdom came from balance, not control. Ember grew larger and more intelligent as dragon magic merged fully with ancient human enhancements, and she could speak now in ways that everyone understood, and she shared memories that went back millennia. One evening, Ember showed Lyra a memory from before the Elven kingdoms existed, and in it humans and dragons worked together, building civilizations and exploring stars, and they were partners in the truest sense. Lyra asked Cain if this was real, and he said yes, and that dragons had chosen to bond with humans first, and when humanity fell, the dragons scattered across the galaxy and waited. Beth returned to Silvermere to help rebuild, and she brought news that the Elven Council wanted Lyra to come home and lead their people into this new age. But Lyra did not want to leave Earth because this place felt important, and Cain needed her here. And the bond between them was still new and fragile and required attention. Claire discovered something in the Earth archives that worried her, and she called everyone together and said that the Cascade Protocol had a secondary function that nobody knew about. The protocol was not just merging technology and magic, but preparing the galaxy for something else, and there were references to Watchers and Guardians and threats from beyond known space. Cain went very still and asked Claire to show him everything, and they spent hours reading old files, and his face grew darker with each page. He finally explained that before humanity fell, they had detected something at the edge of the galaxy, and it was vast and hungry and possibly alive, and human civilization had been preparing to face it. The Civil War had erupted because some humans wanted to weaponize everything to fight the threat, while others argued for diplomacy and finding peaceful solutions, and neither side won because they destroyed each other first. Now the Cascade Protocol had sent out a signal across the galaxy, and that signal would attract attention from whatever was waiting beyond, and they had maybe a year before it arrived. The news spread and caused panic on many worlds, and some wanted to blame Cain and humanity for bringing danger, but most understood that running from threats never worked. Lyra proposed forming a united defense force that combined all races and technologies and used the new merged systems to their advantage, and most governments agreed. Training began immediately, and dragon riders from every species learned to work with human wardens, and engineers like Claire built ships that were alive and responsive. Beth came back to help and brought her best warriors, and she had stopped distrusting Cain and now worked with him easily, and they developed tactics together. Lyra spent time with Ember learning to use their enhanced bond for combat and communication, and the dragon taught her things about flight and fire that no elf had ever known. Cain was quieter than usual, and Lyra would find him staring at the stars with worry in his eyes, and when she asked what was wrong, he said that he feared failing again. She told him that he had not failed before he had survived, and there was a difference, and that sometimes surviving was the bravest thing you could do. The year passed quickly, and the United Fleet grew to thousands of ships and millions of soldiers from hundreds of worlds, and they gathered near Earth and waited. The Watchers arrived exactly on schedule, and they came from dark space beyond the galactic rim, and they were massive organic ships that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality. First contact was attempted, and the Watchers responded with curiosity and confusion, and they said they had felt the protocol signal and come to investigate what had changed. It turned out the Watchers were not hostile, but cautious, and they had been observing the galaxy for millions of years, and they intervened when civilizations became too dangerous. Humanity had been marked for watching after they developed weapons that could crack planets, and the Watchers had been preparing to quarantine them when the Civil War solved the problem naturally. Now the protocol had changed everything and created a merged civilization that the Watchers had never seen before, and they wanted to understand it better. Cain negotiated with them directly and explained what had happened and why, and the Watchers listened and debated among themselves for days. Finally, they said that this new civilization would be given a chance to prove itself, and that they would watch but not interfere unless the galaxy became a threat again. Lyra asked what would make them consider the galaxy a threat, and they said that using power without wisdom or seeking domination over cooperation would be warnings. The Watchers departed peacefully and left behind an embassy station and a communication method, and the galaxy breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the crisis had changed things permanently, and the United Fleet decided to stay together as a permanent defense force, and they called themselves the Galactic Guard. Lyra was offered command of the Guard, but she declined and said that she wanted to return to Silvermere and live quietly with Cain and Ember. Cain was offered a position training new wardens and teaching the next generation, and he accepted because he said that passing on knowledge was the best way to honor those who had fallen. They returned to Silvermere together, and the city had been rebuilt and was more beautiful than before, and the elven people welcomed them as heroes. But Lyra and Cain did not want to be heroes, and they built a small house on the edge of the city near the forest, and they lived simply. Beth visited often and brought news from across the galaxy and stories of how the merge was creating new cultures and new possibilities. Claire came to live in Silvermere and established a research center where she studied the merge and taught others how to work with living technology. The other wardens scattered across the galaxy, and each found a place to call home, and they stayed in contact through the bond network that all wardens shared. Ember spent her time with young dragons and taught them about their history and their partnership with humans, and many dragons chose to bond with humans again. Years passed peacefully, and Lyra and Cain grew older together, and their bond deepened, and they could communicate without words and feel each other's emotions and thoughts. One morning, Lyra realized she was pregnant, and she was terrified because she did not know if a human and an elf could have children together. Cain held her and said that they would face whatever came together, and that life always found a way. Claire examined her and said that the baby was healthy and developing normally, and that the merge had made many things possible that were not before. The pregnancy was difficult and long, and Lyra spent months resting while Cain cared for her and worried constantly. Beth joked that the great warrior was defeated by impending fatherhood, and Cain agreed and said that battle was easier because you knew who the enemy was. The baby was born on a spring morning, and she was perfect and healthy, and had her mother pointed ears and her father gray eyes. They named her Hope because that was what she represented, and she was the first human-elf hybrid ever recorded, and her birth was celebrated across the galaxy. Hope grew quickly and showed signs of both human intelligence and elven grace, and she could communicate with technology like her father and sense magic like her mother. Ember loved her fiercely, and the dragon would let Hope climb on her back and fly around the forest, and they developed their own bond that was different from but equal to Lyra and Cain. More hybrid children were born on other worlds as the merge made cross-species relationships more common, and Hope was not alone in being different. Cain taught Hope about human history and technology, and he did not hide the dark parts, and he explained that knowing where you came from helped you choose where to go. Lyra taught her about elven culture and magic and dragon lore, and she emphasized that power without compassion was meaningless. Beth became Hope Aunt in all but blood, and she taught the girl to fight and defend herself, and said that peace was precious because it was fragile. Hope was 10 years old when she asked her father why he had stopped talking for so long, and Cain sat down with her and told her the whole story. He explained about the war, and the guilt, and the vow, and how her mother kindness had given him a reason to speak again. Hope asked if he ever regretted breaking his vow, and Cain said no, because silence was safety, but speech was connection, and connection was what made life worth living. The galaxy continued to evolve, and the merge created new technologies and new magics, and new ways of living that honored both tradition and progress. The Galactic Guard grew stronger and more diverse, and they prevented several conflicts through diplomacy, and only fought when absolutely necessary. The Watchers checked in occasionally, and they seemed satisfied with how things were developing, and they said that this merged civilization showed promise. Cain and Lyra grew old together, and their hair turned gray and their movements slowed, but their bond remained strong, and they were content Ember aged too, and dragons lived long lives, but even they were not immortal, and she knew her time was coming, and she was not afraid. One quiet evening, Ember called Lyra and Cain and Hope to her, and she said that she had lived a good life and seen wonders beyond imagining. She thanked Lyra for being her rider and her friend, and she thanked Cain for helping her remember what dragons were meant to be. She told Hope to be brave and kind, and to remember that the galaxy needed both strength and gentleness in equal measure. Then Ember closed her eyes, and her breathing slowed, and she passed peacefully with her family around her, and her final thought was gratitude. They buried her in the forest she loved, and planted a tree above her that would grow tall and strong, and remember, life went on because that was what life did. And Hope grew into a wise and capable woman, and she chose to join the Galactic Guard and serve the galaxy. Cain and Lyra supported her choice, even though it worried them, because they understood that each generation needed to find their own path. More years passed, and Cain began writing down everything he remembered about humanity and technology and history, because he wanted future generations to learn from past mistakes. Lyra helped him and added elven perspectives, and together they created a comprehensive history of the merge and how it happened and why it mattered. The book was distributed across the galaxy and became required reading in schools, and it started with a simple dedication that said, "This is for everyone who chose hope over fear." Cain's health began to fail as he reached the limits of human lifespan, even with medical technology, and he knew his time was coming. Lyra refused to accept it, and she searched for ways to extend his life. But Cain stopped her and said that mortality gave life meaning. He said that he had lived far longer than he deserved, and that he had found love and family and purpose, and that was more than enough. On his last day, Cain sat in the garden with Lyra, and they watched the sunset together, and he said that he was grateful for every moment. He said that finding her in that forest had saved him in ways that had nothing to do with physical rescue, and that she had given him a reason to live again. Lyra cried and said that she was not ready to lose him, and Cain smiled and said that she would never lose him because their bond was eternal. He closed his eyes and his breathing stopped, and Lyra felt the bond stretch, but not break, and she knew he was still with her in ways that mattered. She buried him next to Ember under the tree they had planted, and she visited them every day and talked to them about hope and the galaxy and everything that mattered. Lyra lived for many more years after Cain passed, and she continued their work and helped guide the galaxy through growing pains. And she never felt truly alone because the bond remained. Hope became a captain in the Galactic Guard, and she led missions that combined combat skill with diplomatic wisdom, and people said she had the best of both her parents. More human-elf hybrids were born, and they formed their own communities and cultures, and they became bridges between species and ambassadors of understanding. Claire continued her research and made breakthroughs that improved life across the galaxy, and she said that every discovery honored Cain's memory and his dream of knowledge shared freely. Beth eventually retired from military service and opened a training academy where she taught young warriors from all species, and she was strict but fair, and everyone respected her. The other wardens took on students and passed on their knowledge, and they ensured that human techniques and wisdom would not be lost again. The galaxy prospered, and the merge became so normal that young people could not imagine a time when technology and magic were separate. New threats emerged occasionally, and the Galactic Guard dealt with them efficiently, and the Watchers observed and remained satisfied that this civilization was managing itself well. Lyra wrote her own book about Cain and their life together, and it became beloved across the galaxy, and people read it to understand what love and sacrifice truly meant. She described how a silent, broken man had become her husband and partner, and how he had changed the galaxy by choosing to speak and fight and hope again. The book ended with a message that said kindness to strangers could change everything, and that one act of compassion could ripple across time and space. Hope read her mother book and cried and understood her parents better than she ever had, and she visited their graves and promised to make them proud. Years turned to decades, and Lyra felt her own time approaching, and she was ready because she had lived fully and loved deeply and made a difference. On her last day, she sat under the tree where Cain and Ember rested, and Hope sat beside her and held her hand. Lyra said that she was grateful for everything and that she hoped she had been worthy of the trust Cain and Ember had placed in her. Hope said that her mother had been more than worthy and that her legacy would last forever, and Lyra smiled and closed her eyes. She felt the bond surge and strengthen, and suddenly Cain was there, not physically but really there, and Ember was with him, and they welcomed her. The three of them existed together in the space beyond life, and they watched over Hope and the galaxy, and they were content. Hope buried her mother beside her father, and the tree grew larger and stronger and became a place of pilgrimage for people seeking peace. The years continued, and Hope grew old herself and had children who had children, and the family line continued, and each generation carried the story forward. The galaxy entered a golden age of cooperation and exploration, and they began reaching out beyond their galaxy to others, and they brought the message of merged civilization with them. Other galaxies had different challenges and different solutions, but they were interested in learning and sharing, and the network of peaceful civilizations grew. The Watchers eventually revealed themselves fully and explained that they were guides, not judges, and they had been waiting for civilizations to mature enough for contact. They said that the merge created by Cain and Lyra and the Cascade Protocol was unique and showed a path forward that they had not seen before. The human Terran Wardens became legendary, and their techniques were studied and adapted, and new orders formed that followed their principles. Dragons spread across galaxies and bonded with many species, and they carried memories and wisdom, and they remembered Ember as one of the first to bridge the gap. Technology continued to evolve, but it remained balanced with nature and magic, and it served life rather than dominating it. And this was Cain. Greatest legacy. Lyra's legacy was equally important because she had shown that trust and kindness were not weakness but strength, and that opening your heart to strangers could save worlds. The tree that grew above their graves became massive and ancient, and it glowed with merged energy, and people said it was a living monument to love and sacrifice. Hope descendants tended the tree for generations, and they told stories about their ancestors, and they ensured that the lessons were never forgotten. Centuries passed, and then millennia, and the galaxy changed and grew, but the core principles remained, and people still read the books and visited the tree. A young girl named Maya, who was human-elf dragon, hybrid, came to the tree one day, and she felt the bond between Cain and Lyra still existing, and she cried. She had been told she was an abomination because she was mixed species, and she had come to the tree to ask for guidance. The tree glowed, and she felt presences within it, and they told her without words that difference was strength and that bridges were needed more than walls. Maya left the tree changed, and she became a teacher, and she helped other mixed species children understand that they were not mistakes, but miracles. The galaxy continued to need heroes and teachers and bridges, and each generation produced them. And they all traced their inspiration back to a silent man and the elf who married him. The Galactic Guard evolved into something more like peacekeepers and explorers, and they carried the message of cooperation to the far reaches of space. Earth remained a sacred place and a symbol, and people from across galaxies came to visit and see where humanity had fallen and risen and been reborn. The silver network that covered Earth grew more sophisticated, and it maintained the planet as a garden and a library, and a home for any who needed sanctuary. Malachar was remembered too, not as a villain, but as a warning about what happened when good intentions were twisted by fear and despair. His sacrifice at the end was honored because he had chosen redemption over destruction, and that choice mattered even if it came late. The Cascade Protocol became a legend and a lesson about how even mistakes could lead to positive outcomes if people chose to work together rather than against each other. Technology and magic continued to merge and evolve and create new possibilities, and people understood that progress was not about going back or rushing forward, but about growing wisely. The Watchers eventually shared their own history, and it turned out they had once been like the younger races, and they had made similar mistakes and learned similar lessons. They said that the pattern repeated across the universe, and that civilizations either learned to cooperate or destroyed themselves, and there was no third option. The merged galaxy chose cooperation over and over again, and it became their defining characteristic, and other civilizations noticed and wanted to learn. Hope lived a long life and saw her great-great-grandchildren, and she told them stories about their ancestors and about a dragon named Ember and a silent warrior named Cain. She said that the most important thing was to remember that every person mattered, and that small acts of kindness created ripples that never truly ended. On her deathbed, Hope felt the bond that connected all her family, and she felt Cain and Lyra and Ember waiting, and she was not afraid. She joined them in the space beyond, and the family was together again, and they watched over the living with love and pride. The tree grew larger still, and it became a forest, and each tree represented someone who had contributed to the galaxy peace and growth. People walked through the forest and felt the presence of those who had come before, and they drew strength and wisdom from the memories embedded in the living wood. The galaxy faced new challenges, as it always would, And sometimes there were conflicts and setbacks, but the foundation was strong and people remembered the lessons. They remembered that silence could be broken with a single word, and that broken people could heal, and that vows could be remade when circumstances changed. They remembered that love between different species was possible and beautiful, and that hybrid children were gifts, not problems. They remembered that technology without wisdom was dangerous, but technology with wisdom was miraculous, and that magic and science were two sides of the same coin. Most importantly, they remembered that one elf had found a dying human in a forest and had chosen kindness over caution, and that choice had changed everything. The story was told to children at bedtime and taught in schools and shared around fires and transmitted across stars, and it never got old because truth never did. Millennia after Cain and Lyra died, their story was still being told, and their descendants still tended the forest, and new generations still came seeking guidance. A young human boy asked his grandmother why the story mattered so much, and she smiled and said it was because it was true and because it could happen again. She said that every person had the power to change the galaxy with simple choices, and that heroism was not about being the strongest or the smartest. It was about choosing to care when it would be easier not to, and about offering trust when you had every reason to be afraid. The boy asked if he could be a hero like Cain, and his grandmother said that he already was, because he chose kindness every day, and that was where all great stories started. The galaxy continued turning, and civilizations rose and fell and evolved, and the merged technology-magic civilization lasted longer than most, because it had learned the important lessons. Thousands of years after the Cascade Protocol, the galaxy had become so interconnected that the idea of separate species seemed quaint and old-fashioned. Everyone was mixed, and everyone was bonded, and everyone understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. The Watchers eventually departed, saying their job was done, and that this civilization had graduated, and they left behind blessings and well wishes. New Watchers emerged from within the merged civilization, and they took on the role of guiding younger galaxies, and they carried the lessons forward. The cycle continued as it always had and always would, and each generation learned and taught and grew and passed on knowledge to the next. And through it all, the tree forest on Earth continued to grow, and the spirits of Cain and Lyra and Ember watched over everything with love. They had started as broken things seeking redemption, and they had found it through each other and through choosing to hope. When hope seemed foolish, their story became more than history. It became mythology, and more than mythology, it became truth lived out every day by billions of beings. The silent human had drawn his sword and shaken the world, and then he had sheathed it and shown that peace was stronger than war. The elf who wed him had been brave enough to trust and wise enough to love and patient enough to wait for broken things to heal. The dragon who chose them both had been the bridge that made everything possible and had given her life to protect what they built together. Together they had changed the galaxy not through conquest or force but through demonstrating that different beings could bond and create something better than what they were alone. And that lesson echoed across time and space and dimensions, and it would continue echoing forever because some truths were eternal. The galaxy was reborn not once, but continuously, and each rebirth honored the sacrifice and love and hope of three beings who had chosen each other when the universe said they should not. Their names were remembered, and their story was told, and their legacy lived on in every act of kindness and every choice to trust and every bond formed between unlikely partners. And somewhere in the space beyond life, Cain and Lyra and Ember smiled and knew that their gamble had paid off. They had chosen hope over fear and love over hate and trust over suspicion, and the galaxy was better for it. The end was really just another beginning, as it always was, and the story continued being written by everyone who chose to make the same choices they had made, to be kind to strangers, and to fight for what mattered, and to speak when silence was easier, and to love across boundaries that were meant to divide. That was their gift to the galaxy, and it was a gift that would never stop giving, because some gifts grew stronger with time instead of weaker. And in the forest on Earth, the trees whispered their names to the wind, and the wind carried those names to the stars, and the stars sang them back, Cain and Lyra and Ember forever bound forever, remembered forever, teaching that the greatest power in the universe was not weapons or magic or technology. It was choosing to care about someone different from yourself and building something beautiful together from broken pieces. That was how you shook the world, and that was how you changed everything, and that was how you made sure that hope always won in the end.